Okay, have you ever really stopped to think about what separates a tragic accident from an actual crime? I mean, in both cases, someone can get hurt, right? But one might end with an insurance claim, and the other, well, that could mean prison. The answer, it turns out, is all about a kind of recipe, a legal recipe that's been around for centuries.
So what is it, really? What truly makes an act a crime in the eyes of the law? If you strip away all the legal jargon and complexity, what are the absolute essential ingredients? Well, that's what we're going to break down right now. Let's get into that recipe.
It really boils down to two key things. Almost every single crime needs these two parts. Think of them like two sides of the same coin. On one side, you've got the physical part, what we call the guilty act. And on the other, you have the mental part, the guilty mind. You absolutely need both.
You know, this whole idea is captured perfectly in this old Latin phrase from criminal law. It sounds complicated, but the meaning is super straightforward. An act does not make a person guilty unless the mind is also guilty. And that right there is the core of our whole recipe. So first let's tackle the act itself, and then we'll get into what was going on in the person's head.
All right, so ingredient number one, the guilty act. This is the physical part of the crime. Now, you might think this is pretty simple. Someone did something wrong. But, there's a really important distinction here that we need to unpack.
So the fancy legal term for this is actus reus. And here's the key thing. It's not just about the action a person takes. It's about the specific result of that action, the outcome that the law has specifically said, nope, we want to prevent this from happening.
And this is where that distinction really matters. The law makes a big deal about separating the conduct from the result. So for instance, the act of stabbing someone, that's the conduct. But the actus reus, the actual crime the law is focused on, is the homicide, the death that resulted from it. See the difference? The focus isn't just on what you did, but on the forbidden outcome of what you did. Okay, but what if things get messy? What if there's a whole chain of events? How does the law connect that first action to the final illegal outcome? Well, this is where a super important legal idea called causation comes into play.
Let's look at a classic old case to see how this works. It's called R.V. Hilton. So, picture this. A guy in charge of a steam engine does his job, stops it, and then walks away from his post. But while he's gone, some random stranger who has no business being there comes along and starts the engine up again. And tragically, that causes someone's death. So the huge question for the court was, who's actually responsible for the crime here? Whose action led to the death?
Well, the court came back with the really clear answer. They said the death was the direct result of what the stranger did. His action basically swooped in and broke the chain of events. Sure, the original operator maybe shouldn't have left his post. That might have been careless, but he didn't cause the death. The stranger did. This case is a perfect example of why that link between the conduct and the result has to be direct and unbroken. Okay, so we've got the physical act down. That's ingredient one. But remember, that's only half the story. Now we need to talk about the second and just as important ingredient, the guilty mind. The legal name for this one is mens rea, and it literally means guilty mind. This is where the law stops looking at just what happened and starts asking about what was going on inside someone's head. It's not enough to know what you did. The court wants to know what you were thinking when you did it. So to figure out if this guilty mind was present, courts basically ask two main questions. They're pretty simple, but really powerful. First, was the act voluntary? In other words, did you actually choose to do it? And second, did you have foresight? Did you see the potential consequences of what you were about to do? But here's the thing, guilty mind isn't just a simple yes or no. It's not an on-off switch. It's more like a spectrum, right? The law sees that there are different levels, different shades of guilt, all the way from a cold, calculated plan down to just being really, really careless. So let's walk through this spectrum. At the very top, the most serious level, you have intention. This is when you had a fixed purpose. You wanted that result to happen. A step down from that is knowledge. Here, maybe you didn't want the outcome, but you were pretty much certain it was going to happen because of your actions. Then we have recklessness. This is when you see a clear risk, you know something bad could happen, but you just take the chance anyway. And finally, at the bottom of the scale is negligence. This is when you didn't see a risk that you absolutely should have seen. Each one is like a different flavor of guilt, and the law treats them very differently.
Okay, there is one last piece to this puzzle. To really understand the guilty mind, we have to make one more super important distinction.
And it's the difference between motive and intention. Now, this is something that trips a lot of people up. Your motive is the why behind what you did, the emotional reason, like greed or revenge or even love. But your intention is just the what, the immediate goal of your physical action.
Here's a great way to think about it. Let's say someone steals money to feed people who are starving. Their motive? You could argue it's a good one, right? To help others. But what was their intention? Their intention was to steal. That was the direct aim of their act. And here's the bottom line. In the eyes of the law, having a good motive does not erase a criminal intention.
So there you have it, our two main ingredients, the guilty act and the guilty mind. So why does this recipe matter so much? Why is it the absolute foundation of our justice system? Well, it's because this simple formula, the actus reus plus the mens rea equals a crime, is really the bedrock of what we consider a fair system. It's the tool the law uses to separate the things that are truly blameworthy from the ones that are just, terrible misfortunes.
At the end of the day, this whole two-part recipe is what lets the justice system make that huge distinction we talked about at the very beginning. It's how we can tell the difference between someone who sets out to hurt people and someone who just gets caught up in a tragic accident. It makes sure that punishment is saved for the people who are actually morally to blame.
And all of this leaves us with one last, kind of mind-bending question to think about. If a guilty act isn't a crime without a guilty mind, what about the other way around? Can you have a guilty mind all by itself with no action at all and have that be a crime? Something to chew on.